everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast 1991 Retrospective, where we cover an album from the very, very important musical year of 1991, 30th anniversary. A lot of really big, a lot of defining musical and genre albums came out then. We've been discussing them. Our last one was on Smashing Pumpkins' Gish, so go check that out if you haven't seen it. And on a not entirely unrelated note, I suppose, just sort of the same sort of rock kind of era of 1991, where we're going to be talking about Temple of the Dog. And Morgan, you are the grunge boy. Why don't you tell us what Temple of the Dog actually is? Because it's a bit more important than it might initially sound for the uninitiated.
Yeah, so you can't really explain the narrative of Temple of the Dog, and to that extent, you cannot explain the narrative of Pearl Jam, which we will do at a later date, until you talk about Mother Love Bone. So Mother Love Bone was the band that Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard of Pearl Jam were in before Pearl Jam got together. And the sort of subsequent impetus for Pearl Jam's formation was the death of Andy Wood, the vocalist of Mother Love Bone, who is sort of like I don't know, it's like the person that you want someone like Axl Rose to be, just like really bombastic and out there, but like really cool and down to earth.
He had a charisma
Anyway,
about him that was
did,
like very undeniable.
Cornell told stories in the Pearl Jam 20 documentary about how he would be like, well, actually McCready told this story about where he'd be like playing these tiny bars and just doing stuff like, to all you people in the back, and there's like the bouncer, and that's it. But like it just turned every stage that he was on into Madison Square Garden. There was an undeniable charisma about him that Cornell said in the Pearl Jam documentary. That was really his passing of a heroin overdose was really the death of the innocence of the scene. As the way I interpret it is that they saw him hooked up to life support after his overdose, and nobody who saw that was a kid in a band anymore. So Temple of the Dog is the sort of, I mean, it's one album composed of Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard, formerly of Mother Love Bone, in addition to Matt Cameron and Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, and Mike McCready, who would then be the lead guitarist of Pearl Jam. So it's sort of a retroactive supergroup in a way, because it's always introduced to you as the supergroup of Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. But Pearl Jam was really only in its fetal stages at this point. And this album was written and was released before Pearl Jam's 10, and was the first time that most notably Eddie Vedder was heard on a song on the track Hunger Strike, which is fucking have you heard it?
He provides harmonies on that track, and his presence is an integral part of what makes that song what it is. Obviously, Chris Cornell doesn't need help to make a song powerful. Chris Cornell is debatably the greatest rock vocalist of his time. But the range of the vocals on Hunger Strike in particular, the counterpoint between the ranges that Cornell and Vedder sit in, lends that track a particular quality that makes it the word I would use to describe it is haunting. It's funereal. It's just morose. It feels like it is the soundtrack to being at your absolute lowest. And with the death of innocence that Wood's death represented, you had then incorporated into the rest of the scene that developed a preoccupation with death. What's interesting about that is that so grunge is often retrospectively seen as this era of death. The tragedies of Kurt Cobain, of Lane Staley, and not a grunge figure, but also debatably peripheral to that scene, Shannon Hoon of Blind Melon as well, are all these kinds of tragic stories that have colored in retrospect the way in which the scene is looked back upon. But it's easy to forget with that coloring that this was a scene that those three tragedies had happened, and in the wake of Andy Wood, was completely colored and obsessed with the idea of death as a concept. I mean, you don't have to look any further than songs like Nutshell from Alice in Chains, All Apologies from Nirvana, Release from Pearl Jam, basically every single fucking Soundgarden song, all have this kind of morose, dour, tragic, but also like maybe morose and dour are not the right words, because like there's a preoccupation with death, and that's something that gives the music such a sprawling, powerful immediacy.
I think we should all point out too that some of us have watched the Pearl Jam 20 documentary, which opens a lot of, like, especially at the beginning, shines a lot of light on this particular scene and the members of the band, like at the time, like what they were going through, and just sort of lets you into their sort of emotional turmoil and what the mindset was and how they moved on from there. So it's a really good documentary that you should watch if you haven't already. If it sort of gives you a little bit more of a window into a time where, I mean, like Tyler said, it was just sort of like the beginning of an era that was obsessed with and eclipsed by death.
Yeah, and that I think is no greater or more acutely represented than on the opening track of this record, which is "Say Hello to Heaven," which is an absolutely heart-rending song. One
Yeah,
of
it's worth noting at this point, which I didn't actually directly say, is that Temple of the Dog itself is meant as a tribute to Andy Wood and the legacy that he left behind before he died so early. So every single song on here is about him in some way. But carry on.
Yes, no, well put, and of course that is where the direct sentiment, especially of the first two tracks on this record, which I believe Cornell stated explicitly were written as a direct kind of response to Wood's death. You get that sentiment coming through very, very clearly. It's not exactly writing that is dressed up in poetry as much as it is just a raw outpouring of grief, both from the perspective of the grieving and deeply imbued in the perspective of someone who is just on the precipice of death, in any sense that you want to imagine that.
Yeah, the lyrics here are really specific to Andy. The line in the first verse, "He came from an island, then he died from the street." Um, Andy had moved to Bainbridge Island in Washington when he was really young, and he obviously died in the sort of street culture of the early, you know, the nascent grunge scene. Um, the line in the second verse, uh, "Poor Stargazer." Stargazer was the nickname for Andy's girlfriend at the time that he passed away. I mean, it's very explicitly about Andy. And I think it's almost this specificity itself that lends the song to be so universally applicable to grief. I think there's a beautiful marriage of specificity and being able to read into metaphors that are born out of that sort of knowledge of the person that Chris is writing directly about. Um, it's just an extraordinarily rich song for a multitude of reasons, and it absolutely defining moment for the grunge scene in general.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why we made the decision. I mean, we were talking about Gish a couple of weeks ago, where if we were going to, as part of this retrospective, if we were going to chart the ascendance of grunge, which really like came into the mainstream in this year, then we could not do that without talking about this particular moment where these figures came together and created this statement, which is obviously musically terrific and a prime example of some of the most seasoned and influential and important musicians of this entire scene at their prime, but also something that thematically and in terms of the emotional impact of it is a pure encapsulation of the rich connections of the people in this scene and just how emotionally tortured a lot of the experiences that fed into this music were and a lot of the art that came out of it was, but also how cathartic and meaningful and beautiful in a really kind of true and simple way this music is. That is the reason that it connected so much with so many millions of people. That is the reason that it became this, it went from being this fringe thing to being something that completely changed and took over the landscape of popular music. It was a unique moment in history where all of these things came together, and the beautiful richness of the emotions in this music spoke to more people than I think any of the men involved could have ever anticipated.
Yeah, and the thing that I think is interesting about this album, in context of the scene and what it's trying to express, which I was completely unaware of before we started recording, um, is how like soulful the record is, which is not something I particularly think of when I think of grunge, but there's like almost like a lot of tropes I associate with like East Coast soul music all over this grunge record, and it really brings out that heartfelt aspect of it and that mournful aspect.
A lot of blues.
Just,
Yeah, I would almost describe this as a blues record.
Totally the influence that is also like an earlier point of influence that feeds into a lot of this music as well. Absolutely. I mean, even when you look at a song like "Reach Down," for instance, it has this kind of like longing, protracted, just pain to it. And it's another song that is directly about Wood and has these kind of references to conversations with him, and it's also a song about performance as well and how draining that can be, how performance and art as an act of catharsis can be both an act of catharsis and can be this beautiful thing that helps you to save and allow hundreds and thousands of people to feel a form of release, but also that requires you to plunge to your lowest. You got to rest, you got to reach down and pick the crowd up, carry back in your hands to the promised land. I mean, that also obviously speaks to, from Cornell's perspective, Wood's everlasting legacy, the fact that everyone whose lives he touched, whether directly or indirectly, would be carried with him to the promised land.
One other thing I quite like about Reach Down as a song is I think it really shows a willingness and boldness within the performers to just get really unhinged. This song is 11 minutes long, almost double what anything else on here is. And it's punctuated in the middle by this like 8-minute guitar solo, which is obviously fabulous. And I love that this album has points where it's willing to go off the rails, do something that's not necessarily the most commercially appealing idea. And in that sense, it feels like a very assured record with in it of itself.
Was in the again in the Pearl Jam documentary, what Cornell said about that song specifically, he wrote "Say Hello to Heaven" and "Reach Down" as the first two songs after Wood had passed away, and essentially his idea with it was, in his own words, a sort of fuck you to the world of people who don't want to hear a guitar solo. We're going to do a song that's 11 or 12 minutes and is mostly guitar solo, which I kind of really appreciate in retrospect, compared to the fact that Nirvana was the most successful band at that time. So, whatever.
What I particularly love about that guitar solo and the fact that it's in that song is that song obviously being a song about performance, picking the crowd up, and that catharsis of making the art. And so having that solo there so that your focus as a listener is being shifted onto the technicality of what you're hearing, the actual like the performance of the music, the talent and the effort and the all of that stuff that's required. You're focusing on that. You're being made to focus on that through the guitar solo, and you're getting a real kind of. It's almost like you're being transported into the experience of the performers as that guitar solo goes on, as you're suspended in it, and you feel every note kind of ringing out. And it's a beautiful way of taking the sentiment of the song and communicating it through the fundamentals of this kind of particular style of rock music, as well as just fucking ripping and being also, like you said, a total fuck you to anyone who felt that anything that they were doing was indulgent and that was an inherently negative thing.
And what we have to mention about this song is the further part of that Cornell quote was that they met Mike McCready, the lead guitarist on this project, and he was like, "Oh, holy shit, I can actually pull that off." And the spoilers, they did.
By Jove, I think he's got it.
Yeah, it's just fucking McCready is laying down some fucking Stevie Ray Vaughan Hendrix channeled from another planet of blues level shit here, and it's like you have the right edible when you're suddenly experiencing a new religion.
I think it is important to highlight in the way that we are the incredible technical proficiency on this record, because like the real immediate thing, at least for me, is the power of the vocal performances, and that can drown out discussions of the record, as great as they are. And it is a big part of why just the power of that man's voice is incredible. So yeah, I'm really glad we're highlighting the instrumental side as well.
Yeah, I think the drum work on this record in particular is also really noteworthy. Simply for Matt Cameron being able to showcase what he has always been great at behind the kit, which is just absolute raw power. You're never gonna get Neil Peart styles of outright showmanship, but what you are going to get is your face held down to the floor and fucking stomped, and it just like it sinks everything that not just Temple of the Dog did, but everything that Soundgarden did in a realm of, depending on the song, either sort of a downtrodden, doomy, fucking, I mean, doom metal almost sort of dirge, or like, Spoon Man, where it's just the hardest shit you have ever heard, and it's all over Temple of the Dog.
Oh man,
Thank
Save
you.
me!
I think it's interesting Morgan points out doom metal here, because at least when I see discussions of this album, it seems to be really focused on how integral to the narrative of Pearl Jam it is, and correct, obviously. But I also want to say how integral, of course, it is to the narrative of Soundgarden. Is that, like, you're talking about Matt Cameron coming off of the drums, and like how good they've always been in this. Is that Soundgarden was an act, long before this album happened, and as a result, like, I think that shows is that a lot of the, like, they were like, that's the nascent grunge movement. Like Temple of the Dog is like, it's kind of ground zero, in many, like, or just 1991 in general is the ground zero for the movement. You go back and listen to something like Louder Than Love, and you're just like, damn, holy shit, these guys have been making riffs like this and doing music that sounds like they're trying to move a fucking mountain since day one. Holy shit. And I think that translates over to here exceptionally well. Like Morgan says that he'd almost call it a blues record, and I agree. It's blues by way of doom metal almost. I think the sort of like the longer, and I say this and it's like kind of got a negative connotation, and it's not. I'd say it's like the guitars are occasionally kind of languid. Like the riffs are just kind of slow, and it's a lot what like would appear on Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger, which is you have these doomy riffs that go that are so powerful almost that they become psychedelic in nature, that you're just sort of like swept up in them and captured by them. And I think like Reach Down is my favorite song on the record, just because I think it does this flawlessly. I think it's a coalescence of like literally every single talent a part of it, and it's like a flawless showcase of instrumental mastery. And I think it's an exceptional piece of music. I will say, I think that record sometimes does get caught up in a little. Some of the songs do have they're just a bit more turgid than others, and they maybe aren't as forward moving as moments that like the eclipsing highs of Reach Down, which never outright bad, never anything short of great, really. It's just that with an album that swings for the fences as often as this album does, I think it's inevitable that some moments are just going to come up short. But even then, the moments where they really rein it in, they come across as being really reserved, contemplative, thoughtful. And I think it's just such a great, like, even though it was before a lot of albums that would come after it, is that it's just such a perfect encapsulation of what the movement was. And it was so early on. I think it's just so impressive too. I think there's a steady argument to be made that even though it's one album, Temple of the Dog is like is the best supergroup to happen ever. Because frankly,
well, most of them fucking suck. So
yeah, most of them are bad. But what's better?
It's not Audio Slave.
No, and Audioslave's first album is great. But it's not Temple of the Dog. Simply.
No.
I definitely would have to think about that supergroup question for a while. But one thing is for sure, it's if there is a better supergroup, it's nowhere. It's not in this realm of music anyway.
No. Absolutely not.
Yeah, and I think I would agree that this, as an album, this is a little bit, a tiny bit baggy. But also, I would say the joys of this record are slightly different to the joys of records like 10 and Bad Motorfinger, where those are records that are oriented around songs and songwriting, and which is not to denigrate the songwriting on this record. The songwriting, especially on the first 3 tracks, is sensational. But this is a record that is more about, I mean, for me, the joys and the pleasures of this record is more just about immersing myself in the sound of it, like just letting it kind of take me on a fucking journey and relishing in that. And so that for that reason, I don't really hold anything against this record not having the kind of classic feel in terms of songwriting consistently of some of the records that would follow it. It's just a different kind of appeal.
No, yeah, I went and listened to Pearl Jam's 10 this week myself, and that was definitely a huge point in kind of working to understand just the way this record functions and works different to a lot of the rest of the grunge scene, I think, as you've made a great point of. And in turn, it also made listening to this a much more pleasant experience, pleasant relatively speaking, because this is the most depressing thing ever.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the point.
It's not even the most depressing album we're going to do for this retrospective.
No, I'm
Yeah,
saying
that's
that,
unfortunate. I was gonna say Pearl Jam's 10 is also
no, 10
like,
is more depressed. 10's
Yeah.
bleaker than
Yeah.
this.
I'm not a fucking rock historian, but like I think it's pretty much commonly accepted that the death of Kurt Cobain is considered the cultural death of rock music. And
That wouldn't be unfair to say.
yeah, and while I definitely think there is like mostly total truth to that, I think that like in grunge in general, that was like, and I feel like the spirit of it was truly born with Temple of the Dog, really, especially because of the combination of talent that went into it, is that grunge became the beginning of the end. And I would argue that Cobain was definitely that culturally, but I feel like the final sort of death knell of it, so to speak, is actually Chester Bennington. And the reason I say that is because of his connection to Chris Cornell and his connection to coming into the wave of post-grunge and nu metal, which is sort of the immediate rock scene that came after grunge came. And that was sort of like the last shot in the arm, the sort of like last big wave that kind of happened in that particular venue of music. And then once that went away, and once Chris Cornell went away, it was just like, you know, he wasn't like actively making music, and Linkin Park obviously wasn't making the same music that they started out making. But like that sort of closure and finality, I think, represents an incredibly important cultural milestone that was born with Temple of the Dog and ended an era. And I think that like to have that sort of wave of like 30 years of music later, just because of the you know, the death and the unfortunate loss of their friend, that they just sort of like came together, and these talented people like made this really important artistic expression that you can draw all of these lines to, is just like it makes this maybe the most relevant and the most important album that we will talk about in the 1991 retrospective, arguably, obviously, but still.
I think it's something interesting. It's how like grunge, especially. I think it's true for certain artists, but definitely in the way in which the public related to it. It served as like a riposte to sort of how bloated like hard rock and glam rock was getting at the time, you know, and it was bringing this new kind of authenticity. And then with the death of like Kurt Cobain, like what you then get there is a really sobering thing, that like this kind of authenticity isn't cool. And so for like the next 5 years, you get the late 90s rock, you get a lot of sort of cheesy college rock and arguably Smash Mouth, and then with new wave and grunge, it's like, again, we are not, with some exceptions, it's getting that kind of vibe back. And I feel like, especially for me, that's the era of rock I really grew up with. Like we're going to talk about 3 Days Grace next week. That's I listened to them obsessively as a kid, right? Or a young teenager. And then when Chester died, that's, again, it's like, oh shit, this kind of edginess has consequences, and we maybe shouldn't relate to it in the way teenagers do anymore.
I mean, if we're talking about like milestones and the relevance of particular, I guess, less rock per se, and just kind of a particular attitude and mindset in popular music, I would argue that more influential than the death of any figure, even if it's less directly connected to the music world, is simply 9/11. Because throughout the 90s, even after Kurt Cobain's death, obviously rock music, I definitely object to the statement that the cultural relevance of rock died with Kurt Cobain, because I mean throughout the 90s, rock continued being culturally very relevant, just in different forms that were much goofier, right? That were much more, because there had to be a reaction against the kind of sobering confrontation.
You had to have your
death.
dookie to respond to that.
Yeah, or just new metal in general, right? And then so that all kind of came to a kind of apex at the turn of the century, and then obviously 9/11 happened, and the cultural landscape of music, particularly rock music, completely changed, and that was the point at which pop music and what was popular began to kind of veer away from rock music, broadly speaking, and yeah. But I mean, that's a really interesting discussion, but possibly to have at another point. Maybe it gets a bit too far away from Temple of the Dog.
No,
but yeah,
I think that Eddie Vedder popping up on this album too for like the first time is just also very prescient, because like there's any man in rock music who's still making music who there's nobody I have more sympathy for than Eddie Vedder, because I mean, like, imagine, like,
yeah,
the entire vanguard of that movement is just gone now. He's all that's left. And he always lived in, like, if there's anything that like that documentary and the book that I read of recently, Stephen Haydn's Your Favorite Band Is Killing Me, talked about the feud between Nirvana and Pearl Jam. And it just, the impression that you get from Vedder is this incredibly tragic thing as someone who really looked up to Kurt Cobain and really, really, like, in a sense, idolized him. And I feel like, you get this picture of Eddie, who is this dude who climbed on top of the set, and his bandmates were worried on a concert by concert basis whether or not he was going to fall off the top and fucking die. And he was this dude who was just making this music that was just like clearly very evocative, emotionally honest. And he was just chasing this ghost constantly that was just, he'd never get a call back from, and then just like being the lone survivor of that. It's just like, Jesus fucking Christ.
And slight counterpoint to that as well, I think
it feels very emblematic of what I'm saying.
Slight counterpoint to that, I think Eddie is a really interesting figure to me, because he's kind of like the antithesis of the grunge stereotype, right?
Mm-hmm.
This tragic figure who is destined to burn out, or in a blaze of glory. He's been this figure who has been very consistent in what he's wanted to do throughout the years, is not necessarily continued to seek fame, relevance, has just stayed very much with his head on his shoulders, making music that he wants to make and projecting a really positive energy into the world. And people kind of, I guess, forget about that or overlook that. And that's, I think, we can talk more about that when we talk about the legacy of Pearl Jam, specifically when we do 10. But that's a beautiful, like, this record, Temple of the Dog, has both this absolutely tragic, beautiful figure of Chris Cornell, who completely leaned into the darkest aspects of his psyche and was content to mine, or maybe not content to, but still was mined those for his art and made some of the most beautiful art of the scene. You have Eddie Vedder, who did a similar thing, but also was able to escape the clutches of that darkness and move forward. And it's these two kind of totems together. And that's why I think Hunger Strike is maybe my favorite grunge song ever, because it's like, it is a beautiful symbol of the duality, of the complexity of it all, and of the emotionality that's at the heart of it, and just everything about that whole era that's beautiful to me, that's meaningful, is there on that song. Yeah, well, okay then. Should we do our favorite tracks and ratings? My three favorites are Hunger Strike, Say Hello to Heaven, and I definitely Reach Down is obviously as great as those, but just for the sake of not sticking with the top three, I'm also going to make Four Walled World my third favorite track. And in terms of least favorites, I guess I would say the closing track, All Night Thing. And I'm going to give this record an 8 out of 10.
I love the opener. I can't not say Hunger Strike. It's Hunger Strike. I want to highlight Call Me Dog and Wooden Jesus as well, probably. It's really a bad song on the album, but I might choose Pushing Forward Back. It's just my least favorite. I'm going to give the album a 7.5 out of 10.
My three favorites are Say Hello to Heaven, Times of Trouble, which I didn't get to bring up in the main review is essentially the same song as Footsteps by Pearl Jam. Footsteps, obviously written by Eddie Vedder, and Times of Trouble, written by Chris Cornell lyrically. Um, Footsteps is a fucking amazing song, and Times of Trouble is not far behind it. And just to be able to see that dichotomy really directly with two different artists who knew each other and got close, but had two different interpretations of the music that they wrote over, is really really awesome to have. And for third, obviously, Hunger Strike. Um, I don't have a least favorite. Um, I didn't. It's funny. I didn't love this record nearly as much as I do now until like 2 weeks ago. Um, I pretty much had a revelatory listen to it where I was just like, I always held the opinion that like, yeah, it's great, but it kind of falls off a little bit comparatively speaking after the first three tracks. And now I'm just like, no, it's all heaters. 10 heaters, 10 out of 10. Good day.
Nice. Yeah.
I haven't listened
Right.
to Lost Dogs in years, but like Footsteps is if Yellow Ledbetter weren't on that compilation, then Footsteps would be the best song on it. And
Wait, that's the it's a funny thing is Footsteps and Yellow Ledbetter were the sort of B-side, I guess. I don't know, it's because it's 3 songs and not 2 songs, so I guess they're B-sides technically of the Jeremy single.
right, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that, that's the best EP ever recorded.
Yeah, that could be the greatest single ever released. Holy shit. Yeah, baller. August.
Anyway, 3 favorites. I'm not gonna go too far off the beaten path. It's the first 3. Least favorite is maybe it's Your Savior. I'd give it a 7 out of 10.
Neat.
My 3 favorite tracks, Reach Down, favorite track here. It might be the first 3 tracks, but just for the sake of throwing it in, I'm gonna second Morgan. I'll say Reach Down, Say Hello to Heaven, and I'm gonna shout out Times of Trouble also, just because I think that song's fucking outstanding, and it really really kind of elevates that sort of part of the record that I feel like people like, oh no, falls off after, and I'm just like, that song is nope, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I give it an 8.5 out of 10.
You simply must listen to Footsteps now.
It's just that song, but Eddie Vedder is singing.
Oh,
And also like an acoustic guitar, and that's it.
Oh, so basically you want me to put myself through emotional torment. Yeah, cool.
I mean,
awesome.
You're listening to music from the year 1991.
Even the fun Queen album is just like, oh yeah, Freddie Mercury died.
Yeah.
Fuck me, I
Yeah, I
guess.
mean-
Freddie Mercury fucking died.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at the current ranked albums that we're doing for the retrospective, and like, Nevermind is comfortably in the like, this is the happier side of these albums.
You're right. Jesus.
Yeah.
So for our
That
listeners,
dude killed himself.
for our listeners at home who might be stumbling across this, previously in this retrospective, we have covered Blue Lines by Massive Attack, Spiderland by Slint, Out of Time by
Not a
R.E.M.
happy album.
Yep, Queen by Innuendo
That's
by
staying
Queen,
in.
by Queen. De La Soul is Dead, and the Smashing Pumpkins Gush. And the next album we cover, which will be a little bit later because we want to coincide it with the anniversary, is going to be 10 by Pearl Jam. So we're in the thick of it right now, to say
I'm
the
just
least.
thinking about the rest of the albums we want to cover, and it's just like downhill from here.
Well, I mean,
But
Emotionally
quality,
downhill, but my
but-
scores go up. Funny how that works.
that's what I meant. Yeah, I know, right? But that's an 8.2 average, which throws up an interesting cross section of records. The Hoteliers that Never Goes Out, Reanimator by Everything, Plus by Ortega, and Insides by Orbital.
Wow, just
Wonderful.
Tyler Core everywhere Tyler
Yeah.
Core.
Okay, so let us know at home what this record means to you. What is your relationship with Temple of the Dog? What does this album mean to you? What are your favorite tracks? Let us know in the comments below. And basically, I think that's it. I already said our next retrospective is going to be on Pearl Jam when we get to it. So yeah, August, do you want to lead us out?
As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Subway, eat fresh.